And I've assembled some of the guys that have been doing just really cool, interesting work for the last year, even before the 1.0 release came out. So is anyone in the room aware of the 0.8 API that we had out? Could just show of hands, people aware that we had the 0.8 API? Prasad better have his hand up. Yeah, he does. So that was an early kind of developer preview while we were working on the 1.0 that will be instantiated by this product, vCloud Director, that comes out tomorrow that we're not allowed to talk about. That's the 1.0. And it's really exciting because these folks here were working over the last year to give that feedback that created what 1.0 is today and to do early cloud deployments. So we have with us today, and I have their names up there, we have Adrian Cole, who does a lot of stuff, founder of vClouds, works at Opscode, all-around hacker evangelist. Edward Mahler from EngineYard, one of the largest PaaS providers in the world who uses vCloud. And George Reese, founder of Instratus, which is a great software as a service cloud management suite. And myself is James Waters from VMware, and I do cloud solutions and strategy there for them. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a quick walkthrough from each of these folks so they can spend a little bit of 10 minutes giving you some quality time on what they've been working on for the last year and some of their high-level thoughts. And then we're going to go to a moderated panel. We're going to ask, and please, at any time, if there's questions, let's treat this like a small group. Just jump right in. We're here to knowledge share, and I'll get better at doing this over the next year. That's my goal. If I had cliff notes for you of the 4 things that I'll ask you as you walk out, if you know about, this is, from 0 to 1. You have to understand vApps and how important vApps are going to be because they're the fundamental compatibility layer between what you're doing with vSphere and the way you format that and what you can do with vCloud. Very important to understand vApps and the power of those. You need to understand virtual data centers and organizations. Those are pretty important things that our cloud constructs have that other clouds don't have, and they have problems because of that. Robust network control and isolation is just huge. So Adrian's going to give you a little bit of a deep dive on that quickly. Very important. And then finally, more from my day-to-day job, make sure that you understand that there's 1,700 cloud service providers that are already out there, that as our Cloud Director product comes to market, they're going to be endpoints that you can deploy in production or in test dev, all of these things you're doing to the vCloud API. So there's going to be this great grid mesh framework of folks out there that can host your applications. So they're going to each give you a unique perspective. And first up, we have George Reese from Instratus.
Thank you, James. So start off, I don't want to get too, vendory here, but I thought I'd give a little bit of context to where I'm coming from. I'm with a company called Instratus. We do cloud infrastructure management. So that means you go into a portal that we have, and you can provision VMs, set up auto-scaling, backups, encryption, all that stuff, in a number of clouds, including private clouds that be service director based, or a vCloud cloud like a Terramark or a BlueLock. And our differentiation is in the governance area, and we consider governance to be those 6 things you see up on the slide there. So really worrying about the issue of when you're operating across multiple clouds, and generally that means a private cloud plus a public cloud, or even operating in just a public cloud by itself, how you retain control over that infrastructure. One of the key features of Instratus is this idea of cross-cloud operation and how we manage it. You're going to hear Adrian talk a lot about JClouds. You're going to hear me talk about Dasein Cloud and JClouds. It's because we actually work together on a lot of this. And Instratus talks to a cloud abstraction layer called Dasein Cloud. It's an open source library that I started, and a number of people contribute to, including Adrian. And it actually has 2 mechanisms of talking to a VMware-based virtualized infrastructure directly via the vSphere API. And actually, that's kind of a lie. Steve Jin did some Java libraries on top of vSphere, so we're actually using those to talk to the vSphere API. And on the vCloud side, we're using JClouds, which Adrian's the primary contributor for, to talk to the vCloud API. But from an Enstratus perspective, it doesn't know about all that complexity. It's just talking to the Dasein abstraction layer. So, I use there in the AWS world. There's this API called Typica. You've got JClouds that's cross-cloud. You've got Dasein Cloud. And I bring up these three because people are often wondering what the heck's the difference between all these Java libraries. And I use, like I said, Typica here because it's probably the best example of a Java library that's mapped directly onto an API. Typica is a Java library that looks exactly like the AWS API, and if you're used to that, then you can write to that, and then you can't write to anything else. JClouds, I don't know whether Adrian would describe it this way, but I call it a wire abstraction for Java. So it's a layer above that, and that enables you to write cross-cloud Java applications. But it's not I would say it's not really so much a write once, run against any cloud type library. It makes easy. What I mean by wire abstraction is it makes it so that you don't have to worry about the idiosyncrasies of how you connect to each cloud, whether it's SOAP, REST, XML, JSON, whatever. And then the next layer, of abstraction would be Dasein Cloud, which is a completely independent modeling of cloud concepts that then talk to things like JClouds for individual clouds or directly to respective APIs. And the point of I like starting out talks like this because people always wonder what's the difference between Dasein Cloud and JClouds, and the answer is that they both have uses in different contexts depending on whether you're looking for a write once run against any cloud, or if you're talking about writing more directly to the API but not being committed to a particular cloud. So both JClouds and Dasein Cloud are, obviously talk to vCloud, and Dasein Cloud does it specifically because JClouds does it. And then Dasein also talks to vSphere, and one of the more difficult things is coming to an understanding of what the difference between vSphere and vCloud is. And, differences in the name. vCloud isn't a sphere, right? Or, no, it's that vCloud it turns your virtualization infrastructure into a cloud, and vSphere is really just an API into your virtual infrastructure. I know there, oftentimes in a room this size, when you ask people whether they're doing cloud computing, a number of people who've got, vCenter installed in their infrastructure will raise their hand and say, I've got a cloud. And the reality is, no, you don't have a cloud. That's a virtualized infrastructure, and that's what vSphere is for. vSphere enables you to get in and talk to that virtualized infrastructure. vCloud goes a level above that and turns that virtual infrastructure into a real cloud. And that means making it, for example, on demand. So, in vSphere, if you want to provision a VM, you have to know a lot of the particulars about the physical environment that you're operating in, where you want to deploy it, what the resource availability is, and all that stuff. In a vCloud environment, you say, give me a virtual machine, and in a very cloudy fashion, it figures out the best place for it to go and deploys that VM. So, there are a number of ways, that we, as a cloud management platform, leverage vCloud and vSphere. And, as I'd mentioned at the start of this, the primary mechanism is in this idea of hybrid cloud deployment. And obviously, since vCloud is not out yet in GA, there aren't a lot of people we got doing hybrid cloud that is pure vCloud. So like, for example, so the first customer story I'm going to go with here is a customer that has a hybrid cloud that's a combination of public and private cloud. The private cloud piece is obviously today being managed via the vSphere API. And they're running in a private virtualized cloud for all of their PCI functionality, but the other stuff, the catalog and a whole bunch of Facebook applications end up running out in the public cloud. That way they get their PCI compliance, but they don't have to be limited in terms of scalability to what their private cloud infrastructure does. I'll actually go to reining in the rogues and come back to VM migration. Reining in the rogues is actually one of my favorite bits. We got a financial services company that one of the very accomplished VMware customer, thousands of virtual machines running in their private infrastructure. And over the course of the last year or two, the business units haven't actually been going to them for stuff. They've been going out into the different public cloud providers and deploying stuff. So one of the things that we do within Stratus and through our support of the vSphere and the vCloud API is we allow them to just point in Stratus at their different business unit deployments and their private cloud, and they can start getting a picture of how much is being spent on a given project that may span both clouds, or in the case of one business unit that's got resources spanning the clouds but the systems themselves don't, they can get some control and visibility into all that rogue stuff that's been put in the public cloud, and also turn around and make the private cloud component look more like a public cloud so that the internal stakeholders aren't as likely to go rogue as they were in the past. And the last bit, the VM migration, I'll finish with that. It's not as sexy. Got a customer there, who's essentially doing, it's another company in the financial services sector. They have a variety of applications that are driven at the sales level, or for the sales team, that typically have run inside a VMware infrastructure, but the amount of demand that is placed on IT by them coming and say, put this up for 2 days and take it down, isn't as cost effective, even though it's a virtualized environment. So they're going to start using Terramark to move some of those applications using their virtual machine format from their private cloud in the Terramark cloud, and using Stratus to enable the sales team to bring these things up and down on demand for them without involving IT, and be more effective at that migration into the cloud.
Yeah, just take away from George's point is that he's able to mount to vSphere, to vCloud, to other public clouds potentially, all in one interface. And he's standardized application deployment across that in the Stratus framework. That's what was underpinning a lot of his use cases. So next up, Edward's going to talk really briefly about what he's doing at Engine Yard. And the reason this is really exciting is it's one of the largest PaaS deployments in the world. And when they essentially ran out of oomph on another public cloud provider, they turned to vCloud, and I smiled. Because one of the built-in assumptions of cloud that is really going to be shattered this next year by VMware's products is that there's certain performance limitations. Because once you can choose the service provider that you want to run on, but keep the same framework, you get incredible power of choice in terms of performance. So, welcome, Edward.
Hello. As you said, my name is Edward Miller, and I'm a senior systems engineer at Engineard. And like you said, we are a large PaaS. So So if you are writing a Ruby app, trying to get it out there, we basically take that app, deploy it, get it up and running on the internet, help you scale that from one single VM out there to how many ever you need to. And vCloud and our partners, mainly Terramark, help us do that today. I also contribute to Fog, which is an abstraction layer similar to JCloud in a way, but it's written in Ruby. And it has two actual vCloud providers, because the original one is a Terramark-specific provider. Because Terramark was the first company, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was the first company to come out there and actually implement the 0.8 spec. And that's who we're partnered with right now. vCloud 1.0 is coming down the pipe. I saw some opportunity there to refactor the code a little bit, and I created a new provider called, appropriately, vCloud, with the hopes to pull out all the Terramarkisms, because again, version 8 wasn't necessarily a complete API; it was only a developer spec. And going forward, we should have a pretty solid implementation for Ruby of vCloud. So I just want to cover a little bit of our history at Engineard to tell us what brought us to choosing vCloud and Terramark, not specifically Terramark, but definitely vCloud. In the beginning, Engineard started, and we had our own infrastructure, our own little private infrastructure. I call it a pseudo cloud, because we had our own APIs, mostly internal. We could move storage around, we could live migrate VMs and things like that, but it's all ours. We had to maintain it. It was our thing. It was only us. So I was part of that team, and last year we're like, we need to stop maintaining that. We need to not be a hosting company. We need to fully embrace the PaaS model. And we have an Amazon product that's called AppCloud currently, and So we have the Amazon product, and that's great. But again, that's only targeted to Amazon, and we wanted something that enterprises could embrace. And basically, we looked around, and who in the marketplace could fill that role. I mean, it's definitely VMware. Out of all of the potential cloud providers, a year and a half ago, when we started looking around, I mean, only VMware was stepping up to the plate with an API and a cloud vision. And so, we did a review of cloud providers, Terramark and a whole bunch of other ones. Eventually, Terramark won out, and they've been a pretty good partner to date. And I can't wait to see what they do coming up in the future. So that does lead us to now. Got a little ahead of myself on slides. So at Engineard, we use the Fog abstraction layer to target both Amazon Web Services and VMware's vCloud for all of our services. And we're currently migrating all of our customers from our older private product over to what's now called xCloud, and that is a product that is targeted exclusively to VMware and vCloud. We've migrated, a few hundred VMs to date. We're probably about halfway done, and a few hundred, I mean 3, 4, 5. I don't even know. We've taken some large e-commerce sites and scaled them with the help of vCloud, with the help of Terramark, successfully recently. Pushing bandwidth, pushing database IOPS and stuff like that could not be achieved on Amazon. I mean, we even briefly looked at doing it on their new high compute clusters and stuff like that, and we decided we couldn't do it. So it's been pretty successful. vCloud 1.0 is looking to be a really interesting large-scale API compared to version 8. And I actually haven't had as much time as I'd like to play with it because I've actually been on vacation for the last 2 weeks. So I'm kind of psyched even to hear Adrian and his discussion.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks. So bring up next Adrian. And the thing I'd say about the 1.0 API is that the providers that can do it, it's going to be a Cambrian explosion because all of a sudden there's a product that can stand it up. So the availability of that over the next 3 months is just going to take off. So while Adrian's fixing this, I'll just say that Adrian Cole is probably one of the best experts on cloud APIs in the world and has spent the last 2 years of his life essentially coding to every cloud API out there. So when he tells you he likes a feature, listen.
Or don't. So I'm Adrian. I work at OpsCode, and if you haven't heard of OpsCode, you may have heard of the flagship product Chef, which is an open source configuration and integration tool. And what it lets you do is take common parts of infrastructure such as IP tables, rules, and MySQL, master slaves, and bundle up into reusable cookbooks. And then you can use that to automate and sanitize the way you deploy your infrastructure. We call it operations as code, hence the name OpsCode. And so I'm going to start this off with just a simple question, and that is, what does a VMware vCloud look like? And you can answer that question in a couple ways. What I'm going to say is that it's a few things. Because we have to remember what a cloud is, because a lot of times we think we do cloud, as a few of the speakers have mentioned, and it's more than virtualization. In fact, in some cases, it doesn't even have to be virtualization. It's more about on-demand and self-service nature. So, for example, if you can create spaces for your organizations to live in and not bug you, then that's more than just virtualization. That's a process. And the on-demand nature of it, meaning that you can, as easily bring up and bring down infrastructure so that, business teams can, do experiments and such like that. That's also important. I mean, when I came out of, a big bank in England, one of the biggest, interests for them is to be able to deploy like this app 8 times so that each of the developers won't step on each other's toes. And you can do it with a whole bunch of scripts, or you can do it with a system that was made for that. And let's not forget networks too. I'll talk a little bit more about where that is. And essentially, when we get to networks, that's really what separates the boys from the men. Because if you have a cloud API or a cloud system that doesn't have the ability to differentiate networks, it will work in some limited environments. But when you're trying to look at your existing infrastructure and then map it to like a cloud infrastructure, you end up lacking in a lot of scenarios, especially folks from enterprise standpoints. And so in the vCloud system, they have clearly separated IT roles as far as providing resources for organizations within that company or whatever to use, and then those who consume them, so that it's very easy to provision more and more resources or more network resources, whether it's machines or nets, and separate that from how they're used. So you could, for example, build mini clouds, for training systems or your business or channel support, and then actually be able to provision resources behind them without the users even knowing about it. So essentially, it's as if they have their own private IT department, and they don't even have to talk to anybody. So the thing that's different about vCloud than just hypervisor management is that it actually helps you with that process, and it's more than just the consumer side, like give me a server. It's about how do you create a system where giving out servers is easy, and how do you create a system where declaring those network lines are also easy. So there's a couple weedy features. I'll talk about a couple of them. VApps. A VApp is a composite of VMs. So, for example, I worked in a sec lending system once who had essentially 15 components in that app. There was a whole bunch of Oracle coherence and some WebLogic servers and and some web servers. We're all used to this like stack idea, and it's really about an environment for an application. And VMware have modeled that. And when James was talking about like some of the modeling things that are out there, you have organizations to like rope off things for a department or for QA versus prod, but you also have means of aggregating pieces of an application together and then having a single start button, which will put them in sequence and actually start them in the correct order. The other thing is that it has guest customization as a real type. So right now I'm kind of like talking both API and console. It doesn't really matter which you use because at the end of the day it always uses the API. But what that means is that sometimes if you work with things like Amazon's EC2, people have hacks for like injecting files onto this. And it's really just a hack because there's like 2 images in the whole catalog that actually work that way out of a couple thousand. In VMware, essentially, if you're used to the VMware tools, anything that runs VMware tools, you can have like a script that will kick off when the thing boots off. And then whether it's kick off Chef or any other system that you want to do to continue your like process, you can do that. So you're not really bolted into whatever VMware tools provide. You can kick off your own tools. The other thing is fenced networks, and this is one of the other main differentiators between this as a cloud API versus others. A lot of focus, especially over the last year, people have rightly looked at usability, and usability is extremely important. And so, something that provides you with an abstraction that's relevant to your viewpoint is perfect. The thing is that there's not just one viewpoint, right? So, there are people that would only like to see a machine as a couple IP addresses and some storage. But there are other people, right? And some people actually would like to know that this is a NATed system and what, or this has firewall rules, and this is allowed to talk to this network but not that network. And the thing about the vCloud API is that it allows you to do some sophisticated things by creating, like, you could create a grid that can't even talk to the outside at all, but you can also declare tiering of networks where like an upstream network you can have egress but not ingress, or however you might need to do it. So the thing is that like they've thought this through, and if you do have sometimes I've heard, especially over the last year, a lot of people like looking at what you get out of EC2 and then making a decision. Okay, I can go cloud because I can do everything that's in that API or whatever, but that's because there was no choice, and so it's been a real interesting eye-opener for some folks when they get to a point where they can realize that there actually is another way. It's like you don't have to take all these things, these tools that you used to use, like security and such, and throw them away. You could actually have an API that has, for example, the ability to control access on your organizations using your LDAP and everything else you might be using already. At the end of the day, you can use this API to define really sexy stacks or really unsexy stacks. But the thing is that you can do it, and it's your choice, and you're not really constrained by what the API exposes. And so, at the end of the day, it has the right hooks to connect you to whatever your systems management process is. And one process you could connect to is like the Opscode platform, which is like a SaaS for configuration and integration that you can use to kind of like take this bucket of 1,000 orgs with 40 VMs each or whatever, and then make sure you're using the right sort of database configuration code and all that other stuff. But it doesn't have an opinion. And so what that means is that you get to use whatever opinion you already have in your system and make it work. So now go do it.
So that's the introduction. That's their background and experience, and I think they've got, they're amazing trailblazers in my mind because they're out there working on a development version of what we were doing even before it was out. And the product that we're talking about doesn't even come out till tomorrow, to let you guys understand how cutting edge all of this is. So have people had a chance to even glance at the 1.0 spec, by the way? I think it should be out pretty soon. Has people seen a little bit of it? Yeah. I think one of the opening questions I'd just like to talk about, this is my defining bullet point for kind of the vCloud strategy is, do you think the release of vCloud 1.0 ends the myth that somehow certain applications have to be written for clouds? So I'd just like to get your perspective of, does this help ease I had to custom write and custom do everything I did for a cloud environment to have convenience.
Well, I'd say what vCloud does, and if one of the big questions is, why are there so many cloud APIs out there? And the answer is because there's still a lot of innovation going on in cloud, and obviously the big two APIs I'd say would be vCloud and the EC2 API, and the reality is that they both come from very different and neither right or wrong ways of looking at the problem of cloud computing. EC2 is looking at things in the context of greenfield applications that are written for hyper-scalability. vCloud is written as an API that models the concepts we know in an internal data center and cloudifies them. And like I said, neither's wrong or right. They're just two different ways of looking at the problem. And so once you've got the existing internal data center modeled, you can then start taking applications that depend on that model and put them in the cloud, which you could not do with an Amazon.
So let me challenge for a second there, though. I mean, Adrian, you made an interesting point that people were making assumptions before in the cloud because they didn't have choice. I mean, do you think that even some interesting new applications you might want control of, organizations, networks, et cetera?
I'd actually suggest that it's not. I mean, basically, it's in my opinion, enabling old applications. Because if for example, the first question probably anybody gets is like security. What do I do about this thing, right? And the other thing is that how do I get out or how do I get in? There are some things that the API inherently has in the vCloud system that, like for example, were very difficult things to do, even if they're possible in some of the EC2, like especially like image conversion and things like that. Whereas while OVF may not be embraced by all, it's certainly embraced by more than just Amazon. And so, for example, if you do need a system whereas you can, move your isolated code in and out freely, that's actually probably going to enable existing customers. My guess is, as far as it being an either or, I agree with George that it's not really that. However, I'd say that especially early last year, it was probably pretty tough to take like a traditional app and run it in like EC2, which had basically been the defining cloud, especially because that was before Rackspace. And so a lot of the things that the first folks that went to cloud built their architectures around those things. And I would suspect that while for example, George has had a continuum of customers throughout those ages, there were probably different periods, like the Jurassic period of cloud. And if folks were in that period, they had probably significantly changed their application architecture, even if it might be less so today. But
yeah. Everett?
From our perspective, I mean, you take that large e-commerce site that I mentioned. I mean, that was originally developed by a guy on his laptop, I believe, or like one or two guys, using the standard Ruby stack of Ruby, Rails, MySQL, and then it was deployed on Engine Yard, and it ran for a long time with minor tweaks. So it was the same application. There's no way we could have moved them, or we could have moved them to EC2 to do that in any time frame. They would have had to rewrite their app to shard their databases, or move to something like a MongoDB or React or Hadoop to do some of their data loads and things like that in a distributed fashion. And the problem with them, their business grew so fast and so rapidly that they literally couldn't hire enough engineers, and they've got the whole Mythical Man month and things like that. They can't rewrite their app fast enough. So we were able to move them to a cloud, get them going, scale them up really fast. I mean, we created a few hundred extra VMs for them, like that.
Yeah, and then you're able to be portable. How many people here love rewriting applications to deploy them? Anyone? Okay, we're good. This is good strategy.
Yes, so, I mean, I agree with George in that it doesn't have to be neither or. Neither one is right or wrong. It depends on where your priorities are.
It might be more about the platform APIs than it is about the infrastructure. Because at the point where you're probably laying bits down on an operating system, you have one thing Randy Byers does mention a lot is that it's more about your architecture than your APIs, and so when you bind yourself to like an SQS or when you bind yourself to an S3 and then you may have like written dynamo behavior into your application that you would expect systems like that, and those are really platform issues more. And the thing about like a vCloud or to a certain degree an EC2 for that matter is that you can kind of especially more on today that there are more and more options for people to deploy platforms, and that may help reduce this like kind of like PaaS lock-in thing. But I would suspect that anybody who has written like an application, like for example, I think Rayscale has like some sort of grid program that uses almost every like Amazon service there is. And a lot of people, like I get this a lot on JCloud's list, are like, where's the cloud watch for Rackspace? And like the person, might keep asking me the same question. I'm like, dude, there is none. It's like they haven't done this on all clouds, and each cloud decides what services they deploy, and the first start for most of them is simply providing compute resources, and things like platforms come later.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting thing in terms of, I think one question I think I'd like to frame for today is, okay, I've got an application and I'm thinking of writing it to an automated infrastructure. Should I be targeting kind of the vSphere API potentially, or vCloud is a more abstracted way to go in the future? And Edward, you had some interesting comments over lunch that you might want to share where you would kind of build to.
Well, I think George was pointing out that vSphere is a way to automate your VM infrastructure, but that does not a cloud make. That's the beginnings. And I don't know, George, you actually could probably say it better. Some of the words were yours, and I expanded on them.
Well, the thing about vSphere is, you're telling vSphere, launch a VM, here's where you're going to launch it, and you have to know all of this stuff when you're making the decision about the underlying infrastructure. With vCloud, vCloud makes it cloudy. You don't know that. You're just you're requesting the cloud to provision stuff in typical cloudy fashion. It figures out where the right place to do it, and also, I guess this isn't really inherent in the difference in vCloud and vSphere, but it is practically one, is that, when you're in a cloudy environment, you typically have a more limited choice of what VM types and stuff that you're going to launch, whereas vSphere is sort of a blank slate. You can do whatever you want against, and that may sound like a good thing, but when you're trying to create an environment in which elasticity is happening a lot, the level of control and decision making that needs to go in vSphere is just not a good thing. And
I think a good example of that is we've done some work in the ecosystems team to integrate into F5 load balancers with the vCloud API that's coming out. And when you've got a load balancer like an F5, you don't want to have to give it too much detail, right, about everything it should be looking for. You just say, request a resource of this template type of this network setting and go and add it, and you don't have to tell it anything else. And I think that's the kind of exciting use cases for cloud APIs, at least one that's been very popular with the early customers we've shown it to.
Yeah, and I, so the question is, which one if I'm writing against, which is really your what I do, and I'd say, if you've got the option, go for vCloud because it's more future proof. It doesn't prevent you from doing stuff with vSphere, but the reverse sort of is true. If you were to write an application that is written against the vSphere APIs, go cloud.
Well, plus I don't think anybody's going to be offering vSphere publicly as an API to target. Especially after the 1.0 release. Yeah. Where so if you're writing stuff these days and you're building up a little internal platform, if you're doing a lot of internal apps and you need to burst, you need to grow, you've grown, you need to move your workload somewhere else, you don't have to retool.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things is enterprises will ask us, hey, we'd like to write a new deployment platform across different providers, and how would you suggest doing that? And some of them said to us, today we're just buying hosted vSphere from 5 different service providers, and my eyes light up. I'm like, boy, do I have a story for you, because we've got one, API to write to with a defined set of criteria that only moves once a year, where you can target seamlessly now your internal cloud that you can make, because we're a software stack, you can deploy us wherever you want, as well as automatically extend to a Terramark or a Savas or whoever you like that's hosting that. So I think I'd like to get you guys' thoughts on the future of kind of like enterprise provisioning, right? I mean, this is what this is about. When you're provisioning an enterprise app in the future, I can envision a world where the application guy might have no idea where it actually might ultimately rest. And that might be extracted from him. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I definitely do.
Go ahead.
I mean, we're rolling out a feature in Stratus in the next couple of weeks where if you can configure your vCloud infrastructure to auto scale up to a certain point, and then it will roll out to a public cloud automatically once certain capacity elements have.
So if someone had a vSphere.
Right.
If you had vSphere built in today and you're using Stratus, you could then burst out as you need more capacity to automatically deploy through Stratus to another provider.
To another provider, and all you're doing is you're telling in Stratus the nature of the application, giving it the application code, saying here are my auto-scaling characteristics, here are my governance and financial and security characteristics. In Stratus, you take care of worrying about where it goes, when it goes, and how it goes.
Edward, could you ever see Engine Yard using more than one provider?
At one point, no. I was actually firmly in the camp at one point, believe it or not, that we should do it all ourselves. And as I talked over lunch, we actually designed our own cloud, we redesigned our own cloud at one point. And thankfully, the business people said, don't do that.
Cool. So could I get people to say, what's your favorite thing about the vCloud API? This is such a softball question, but if there's one thing that you would say, hey, check this out. I'll say mine is the network isolation and the ability to do a firewall on a 3-tier application so you don't have to rehost it.
You picked the easy one.
That's kind of important, right?
Yes, it is.
You can also talk to it, yeah.
Okay, ask me last year, I would not have actually been as much a vCloud fan, if I'm honest, right? Yeah. I work with a developer API. It had a lot of it looked like, if you didn't look clearly at the vision, it looked like a lot of scaffolding, and now you see what happened, and it was basically they were listening, and this skeleton was there to actually hold up a body, and part of that is this VApp thing, and what I like about the VApp, and it's something that people have tried before, but when you can compose apps together, you can grow one, and then when you're finished, you may have this seven piece application. You can export it into a known format, like an OVF format, and then you with VMDKs and everything, and you could actually transport that someplace else. And I think that for those of you who have worked in clouds, try and take some, Ed, you've probably worked on this stuff, right? Yes. I mean, try and actually move something from one cloud to another. It's not just can you stop API exist thing. I mean, there's actually moving stuff and actually having it coherently land somewhere else. And I'd say that's probably the most exciting feature.
Yeah, I mean, currently at Engine Yard, we have whole teams that are dedicated to migrating. So I can't wait to get on V1.
I think that's one of those features that is to make it more transparent where you deploy. Because when you can bring a bunch of things all at once, already talking to each other and network together with policy, I think that helps you get more interchangeable in where you go. Adrian, do you want to talk at all about how Opscode platform is working with the vCloud API and what you're doing with that?
Sure. Yeah, so Opscode works with an open source model for everything that ends up being installed on any server. And so, for example, the way that people kind of organize their IT, they might be using either the console or they would use this tool called Knife to spawn up cloud servers. And that actually uses other open source tools, for example, Fog. And so what we're working on right now is we're working on the finishing of the vCloud 1.0 so that essentially you would be able to essentially download an open source Ruby app called Knife that can deploy 6 nodes into a vCloud and actually run things that you had listed in your run list. It might be, for example, like I mentioned before, like I have 2 MySQL slaves and 1 master, and so essentially you can take this from a layered approach where you have provisioning, which essentially like vCloud is like the expert provisioner. And then you can, that's not the whole story. So you have your configuration management, you have your integration on top of that, and that's where Chef kicks in. So Opscode spend a lot of time on the open source work, and then what they also have to offer is this platform, which is like a SaaS configuration management, which is what the Chef server is that you might run normally. But what it has, just like vCloud has these orgs, where you can like invite different people in your IT organization to do certain tasks. Like, I might be, Ed's on vacation. I need to take over deployer role. Well, there's a lot of tools where like they fall short there. One of the things about the Opscode platform is that it marries very well up to what you end up needing when you're running an IT shop, and it allows you to do a lot more agile roles. So, for example, if you have a small team and you're doing this like very agile team where folks do different tasks at certain times, it's very easy to let them collaborate. And so the Opscode platform is a way that you can kind of host that configuration management side of ops, which then layers nicely on top of something like vCloud.
Excellent. What do you guys think would be the first application you suggest to somebody to deploy to the vCloud, given that you've seen it? If just any tips for, hey, I'm an early user to this. What's the best way to get on the learning curve? Maybe even within Stratus, George.
Is the question what sort of application would be?
Yeah, where have you seen early success with your customers? Where's the sweet spot there?
I mean, the easiest, best application profile for a vCloud deployment is going to be one that is dependent on the traditional perimeter based network security, because vCloud's the only solution that can deal with that in a good way without a lot of complexity.
Okay. Great. When you guys made decisions about service providers, I know you've picked a service provider before, Edward, and Adrian, you've dealt with a fair number of service providers early. Any hints or tips on, hey, there's going to be this big ecosystem out there. I know that it's early days. It's Cambrian right now. It's taking off. I'm a new VMware user. There's vCloud providers out there. Any things you guys look for, how you test, how you think about that decision?
Well, one thing I talk about on this, just to let people think about it more, because sometimes you don't know what your choices are. And so, I advise people to, bring up the bar a little bit. Like, choose I call it the cloud with a career plan. So if you get very successful and then you have to do more sophisticated things, you don't want to have to completely change your IT process in order to, accept maybe a more demanding customer. So for example, if you have a very nice service, like maybe it's even a blog, you may have regulated customers who might want to use that service, and you have to turn them down unless you have an auditable system. And so, like for example, George does a lot of work with this cloud audit program, which helps people get information about decisions about, and it's more probably about the process than it is the hardware necessarily. But I say that probably the more important thing to think about is clouds who have tiered offerings. Terramark is one of them, BlueLock's is another, and essentially it's not just like, do I have an API that gives me like a VPN? That's good. That's actually you should pay attention to that. But there's more to it too. You can actually ask, does a service provider have the ability to do forensic research on disks that were hacked? Do you have an answer to that question?
Yeah.
And then the thing is that be bold enough to walk away. Like the cloud doesn't force you. Like the voices inside my head didn't say I must use this cloud, right? Like if they're not giving you the right service level agreements or guarantees that you need, walk away. And then ask folks like in Stratus who are very familiar with this cloud audit spec, who might be a better choice.
I think that's really one of the other really killer features of vCloud potentially, is because you have multiple providers, you can start to specify exactly what you need, but because you've written to that open standard spec of vCloud, you're not having to really do too much to negotiate between the two. And in previous clouds where they sort of the provider also made the software, you're kind of, hey, that's what you got. Once you write to it, you're there.
By the way, that really is my favorite future feature is vMotion between clouds.
So when's that coming?
Is that you're going to have that like during the negotiation? You're like, do you want me to click move right now, or do you want to comply with my terms? So, did you have any thought on picking a service provider, or how you?
Well, a little bit to summarize essentially what Adrian says, the most important thing in a cloud provider is transparency more than anything else, because when you're talking about the emotional thing and the real thing about moving to a public cloud environment is the loss of control aspect. Some aspects of loss of control represent real issues, some are just emotional, and the only way to get over them is to have the appropriate level of transparency in a service provider.
Yeah. Edward?
Yeah, I completely agree with him. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, we went with Terramark. We can get them to pretty much audit anything.
Yeah, and the assumption always before was if you go in cloud, well, you have to give up security, auditability, and compliance kind of in your own vein. You're going to have to give up a lot of your existing constructs. You're going to have a new format, new networks, and maybe somebody with a new skill set. So we're trying to blend that out a little bit more with what we're doing with vCloud. I'd ask you a question. There's some different approaches here. We have in Stratus, which is more of a software as a service. We just deploy the application right to. You've got Engine Yard, which is more of a PaaS here, and you also have JClouds for Adrian. How do I'm a developer and I want to go out and deploy an app. How do I choose between an Stratus, an Engine Yard, and a JClouds? I mean, any color on that, and fight it out for me.
JClouds, is really suitable if you're right. There's nothing, I guess I would say, that is an either or with respect to JClouds. You might use JClouds to do your applications talking to different cloud services, and use Stratus to manage the overall deployment of that application to your target cloud.
So you're compatible with him, Edward?
Yeah, so Stratus might help you deploy that application to one or more clouds, right? I mean, that's its basic thing, right? So I'd like to think of us as a step above that to some extent. We make the choices on the cloud and help guide you to a particular cloud based on your app, your business needs, SLA requirements, all these different things. We only really support Ruby. We have a well-defined stack page, well-defined list of software and stuff like that we support. We've got a world-class support team behind that. Should your application fall down, should you become the next big thing, or you have a Facebook effect type of thing happen to your site, we can scale you on those clouds. So it's not just purely deployment. It's deployment plus services, a certain particular set of software that's supported by a world-class organization.
You guys get a lot of marketing apps and like Ruby consultants often kind of deploy to you, and there's a certain type of application that often comes your way, right?
They're large. I mean, they're all Ruby apps, of course, because that's our thing. We have a partner network that we work with. They both bring clients to us, as well as we refer clients of ours to them. If you happen to, again, have that Facebook effect or something like that, where you're one guy and you write an app and it's stupidly successful, and you've got money to spend on fixing it, we can refer you to a partner if it's broken in a particular way.
And then JClouds as an open source project is really more about supporting others, and I really mean that. I mean, for example, J is for Java. It also does Clojure, which is like a Lisp variant. But the type of folks that integrate with it are generally other libraries or management tools. So, for example, there are projects to do Hudson plugins for continuous integration, so that you can deploy build servers. We have folks like other libraries like in Stratus is Design, which actually is not limited to in Stratus folks like George mentioned. I work on that too. There's also like another Java project called Whir, which spins up like Hadoop and Cassandra clusters and stuff. And there are folks who just use it for infrastructure management, and there's different things, but essentially jCloud really kind of sits as a library you would deploy in your Java application. It wouldn't make sense in Ruby.
If you're really close to the application, like the way you guys build on top of it, really in the app, jCloud makes a lot of sense. If you're just deploying an app, that's already maybe pre-formatted and you have policy, and Stratus is a good move. And if you just got some cool Ruby code for an application you just wrote that might hit the Facebook effect, maybe look there.
Yeah, I'd put in Stratus down to if your organization has any sort of compliance requirements, whether it's an internal compliance or external compliance, the only way you're going to meet those needs in a public cloud is to use Stratus to manage that deployment.
Yeah, but it's interesting that all three of you kind of get some unique perspective and some unique things out of vCloud.
Yeah.
And I think the original purpose of the panel was just to get together some people doing some ecosystem stuff and show you the diversity of activity there. We have about 5 minutes left. Show of hands. Any questions at all for these folks? Yeah, great.
What's the biggest feature that's missing out of the vCloud API?
So I'm going to take a swing at this one. And this is something I bring up, and it's just because I think that there, like I mentioned about different views, like for example, EC2 is one perspective. Yet you could put pretty much anything on the EC2 API on vCloud underneath, because it's a subset of features. So I think that there's probably room for a very simplified, OpenStack / Rackspace type of a perspective on vCloud. vCloud is extremely useful and critical because there are certain apps you just can't do with some of the simplified APIs. But I think that right now the way you work around it is you would use something like a jClouds to kind of dumb it down for you, or designed to do that as well. But if you really have those simple needs that you really just want to spin up something with Ubuntu on it, period, and you don't care about anything else, then that's a perspective that vCloud doesn't center itself on.
Yeah, we took this odd idea that all of this enterprise spending that's out there, with people spending billions of dollars a year with existing processes and existing policy, might be a good place to attack and to do R&D.
Well, I'd say independent block storage devices.
Yeah, but you could easily. It's just a matter for a provider to come up front and go, okay, you've got this subset, and
it's really kind of weak. I'm going to put it out there. I mean, you can certainly, there are worse things to have. Probably what George mentions is much more, useful.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's one I've thought of when we talk about. Any other questions? Hey, just jump. Oh, Lou, first class. Metering and monitoring. So Redwood, when it comes out, has built-in integration to Chargeback Manager. So that's more of a private cloud story in terms of importance, because when you go to a service provider, you're going to get that one way or the other, regardless of technology. But yeah, so Chargeback, as soon as you create an organizational construct in vCloud, that'll be ported over into Chargeback. And so Chargeback will know which users and what organization for what bill. So anything you can do in Redwood in terms of organizations will carry over to Chargeback, and you'll get your bill off that.
And actually, Stratus does financial controls on top of vCloud and vSphere, so that you can manage budgets across all the different clouds you're operating in. And even if they're charging you in different currencies, it's a multi-currency financial control system.
One thing this kind of brings up, which is just one thing to look out for, is that there are two APIs in vCloud, and there probably will, as other APIs come out, as we're in a more mature landscape than we were a few years ago, you'll find that they're, admin side and user side, and so a metering and monitoring part would probably be on the admin side. I'm going to admit that I haven't read through all of the admin section either, and it might be that there's a feed API there, but if there isn't, one thing is that they have, this is 1.0, there will be a 1.1 probably. So if it isn't there by a spec, certainly vote that up, because that's a great unlocker. Yeah, I mean, probably about 30% of my pre-launch meetings have been around charging and billing, and all of the BSS side is incredibly important if you want to have a real deal cloud. There's no doubt about it. There's a question in the back before. Yeah, it's you. Go ahead.
I'll give a quick answer from my perspective. I don't know, Adrian, when you were at VMware, did you ever hear me talk about MySQL and performance on that ever? It's probably one of the things that keeps me up at night, which is that when other clouds came out, they spent a lot of time talking about distributed data stores as the primary mechanism for scaling. The reason they did that is that they have poor choke point performance on IOPS and IO. So they needed you to spread your data out in order to get an aggregate performance. I think one of the big things that we focused on with vCloud is the ability to have a higher performing hypervisor that gets more bits in and out of quickly. So IO is one of the hardest things for a hypervisor to do. We have IO control that allows you to make sure that you get 100% of what you've been assigned as opposed to the noisy neighbor problem. And so we've done everything we can to kind of extend the existing database model as long as we can and to deploy like that. It would be the best answer I'd give you. So performance is definitely something that we focus on, and the reason is traditional data stores.
I think you need to use the database that's appropriate to the problem domain. And if you've got data that isn't transactional, that is heavy read, then a distributed database, a NoSQL database system is probably going to be the better solution. But if you've got transactional data and you care about data integrity, you need a relational database system. End of story.
Yeah, I mean, those things are only going to scale so big until you have to reevaluate.
Rich?
No.
You mean like a push API to tell you? Not currently. I don't know of an API that does.
Not yet. I don't know of one that does that efficiently, but we talk about that kind of stuff.
It would be nice if a task could call a webhook.
This comes up
Every cloud provider or everybody who's doing an API has heard from me, including the VMware team, I want a push notification system for changes in your cloud. It hasn't happened yet.
Keep pushing.
Good questions. Really good questions. Any other ones? Cool. Well, it's a minute and a half after. I think that's our time allotment, right? So it's 4:02. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Great panel.